What is the Schomburg Center? To me, it is home. The place where we come to see who we really are, not just somebody else's reflection of who we are.
The Schomburg Center is a place of culture. It's a place of history. It's a place of knowledge.
The Schomburg Center, to me, is a repository of all of the things that has documented our sense of worth as a people.
For me, that means that it is a place of immense power.
The Schomburg Center is a public research library and a cultural institution.
For the study of the Pan-African world.
It is perhaps the best in the world.
My Schomburg Center is Arturo Alfonso Schomburg.
Arturo Schomburg said, Black history and culture and intellect exists at a time when most people didn't believe that. He collected those evidences, and that became the beginning of the collection.
And it has expanded and has grown to where it is now a world-class institution.
It holds over 10 million items.
There's no parallel anywhere that brings to light what we as people of color have done, what we continue to do.
Black culture is all of culture. The universals that animate everyone's life happen here for all people.
The Schomburg, for me, is one of the center pillars of Harlem. When I started the journey of finding out about Red Rooster and Harlem, the very first place I went to was the Schomburg.
Researchers from around the world come and use what we have here.
I could not have written just about any of the books that I've written without the Schomburg Center's archives, resources.
The Schomburg Center is much more than a library. We encourage lifelong learning and exploration.
The Junior Scholars Program is a Saturday program with students from 5th grade to senior year in high school to help them learn about Black history and culture.
Learning about my history is important because it teaches me who I am.
The Schomburg Junior Scholars Program is going to do nothing but uplift them.
So many talented and brilliant people have walked the corridors of this amazing institution over the years. From Octavia Butler to Toni Morrison and James Baldwin, Ella Fitzgerald, Alvin Ailey, and Harry Belafonte, who graced the stage in this room of the American Negro Theater.
This place evokes great memories. It was a gift to us in our community to really try to find that space to reflect expressions of Black experience. I just knew that the environment and what I saw these young African Americans doing was a place I needed to be.
What is my Schomburg Center? I'm standing here at the Cosmogram, which underneath holds the ashes of the poet Langston Hughes. On the evening when this Cosmogram was dedicated, people began to empty out of the auditorium. A jazz trio struck up, and to my amazement, Amira Baraka went over and asked Maya Angelou for a dance. And they started to dance on top of the Cosmogram, on top of the ashes of Langston Hughes, and I felt what a fitting way to kiss the memory of Langston.
The Schomburg Center is a research institute and a library, but it's so much more than that.
There's something going on every day.
So many amazing people come here to talk about their creative craft, to share what inspires them. The Schomburg Center's collections help to tell stories even beyond our walls.
The Schomburg Center is here in this exhibition at MoMA, One-Way Ticket, Jacob Lawrence's Migration Series. We depend on the resources of the Schomburg to enable us to tell this story. Thinking about the implications of the past on the present is absolutely crucial for understanding the next steps, understanding what we have to do to go forward.
We today have the responsibility of making sure that new artists and activists, new scholars and poets know that this place continues to be a resource and a source of inspiration for the work that we must continue to do.
The Schomburg Center is knowledge.
The Schomburg Center, to me, is education.
The Schomburg Center is home, it is family, it is foundational.
The Schomburg Center is inspiration.
The Schomburg is with me in everything that I do.
Community, inside and out.
The Schomburg Center is us.
The Schomburg Center is you, and we invite each and every one of you to find your Schomburg Center.
Hello and good evening. Thank you very much. My name is Katie Tubman. I am the Schomburg Center's Manager of Education Programs and Director of its Junior Scholars Program, which is a Saturday school that provides historical literacy and arts education to over 100 middle school and high school students across the city, Massachusetts and Connecticut now. It is my privilege and honor to welcome you to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Now, because I know there are a lot of educators or educator-adjacent people in the audience. Show of hands, how many of this for you? Is this your first time at the Schomburg Center? Wow. Okay, I can continue on with my speech. Good, good, good. Okay, for those of you, how many of you have actually been here before? This is not your first time. That's actually good. Nice. All right. Well, whether it's your first time here, if you recently visited with us, I want to remind you that the Schomburg Center is a collective and sacred space. Matter of fact, it's your collective and sacred space. Collective, because the center has been dedicated to the collection, preservation, and interpretation of the global Black experiences since it was nearly founded 100 years ago. Over the course of nearly 100 years, the Schomburg Center's librarians, curators, educators, and other professional staff have worked tirelessly to provide robust, free, public access to our over 11 million items that document Black life and promote the study of history and culture of people of African descent. Sacred, because we believe that the study of Black history and culture is the study of humanity, imagination, and liberation. History is not only housed here, it is made here. Programs like the one you're attending this evening exist because of our sacred and collective commitment to humanity, imagination, and liberation. We hope you continue to visit the Schomburg Center and access our collections, public programs, and exhibitions. It's an honor to partner with Columbia University's Teachers College and the Black Education Research Center for what I know will be a powerful conversation. Before we start the program, some brief housekeeping. At this moment, please silence your listening devices. Please, all devices be on silent. We do ask that you not flash photography the conversation or record. This is being recorded for live stream, so there's an audience on YouTube watching right now, and we do not want your recording or in-person experience to interfere with theirs. All right, well, if that's set, everyone put their phones away? I'm not checking. I will check if I see. All right, just kidding. So please help me start off the event and welcome Dr. Anne LeBeau, the BERC's Executive Director of Strategy and Operations, to the stage. Welcome again, and enjoy tonight's program. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I just got a promotion. I'm actually a doctoral student, but I'm very pleased to know that I finished. My name is Anne LeBeau, and I'm Executive Director of Strategy and Operations for the Black Education Research Center at Teachers College. It is my distinct honor and pleasure tonight to be able to introduce Dr. Tom James, who in turn will introduce Dr. Sonya Douglas. Tom James works as Professor of History and Education at Teachers College, Columbia University. He is Director of the History and Education Program and Co-Director of the Center on History and Education. His teaching interests include history of education in the United States, historical methods of research, institutional histories in higher education, and learning through experience. From 2007 to 2019, Professor James served as Provost, Dean of the College, and Vice President for Academic Affairs at Teachers College. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tom James.
It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Sonya Douglas. Dr. Sonya Douglas is Professor of Education and Leadership and founding director of the Black Education Research Center at Teachers College, Columbia University. Her research focuses on the politics of race, education policy, and leadership. She is especially interested in how leaders of education systems conceptualize and center equity in their leadership philosophy and practice. She has published more than 20 journal articles and 5 books. So for the sake of brevity, I will just mention two of her widely known books. Learning in a Burning House, Inequality, Ideology, and Disintegration, published by Teachers College Press in 2011, and The Politics of Education Policy in an Era of Inequality, Possibilities Toward Democratic Schooling, which Routledge published in 2019. Well, in 2017, Sonya Douglas founded the Black Education Research Collective, which is now a center at Teachers College. Its acronym is BERC, and its aim is to convene scholars devoted to conducting, translating, and disseminating research that leads to improved educational opportunities, experiences, and outcomes for Black children and youth. Professor Douglas is currently the principal investigator of New York City's Education Equity Access Plan. This $20 million initiative focuses on developing an interdisciplinary pre-K through grade 12 Black Studies curriculum and a professional learning plan for New York City schools. With these brief comments, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sonya Douglas.
Good evening. Thank you, Tom, for that kind introduction, for co-hosting tonight's event with the Black Education Research Center at Teachers College, Columbia University. It is particularly meaningful to host this evening's event with Tom James, not only because he is a prolific and thoughtful scholar and historian of education, but because he also hired me nearly 7 years ago during his tenure as provost and dean of Teachers College. Tom was also a very early supporter of my vision to establish a research center that would focus on advancing culturally sensitive research to improve the educational experiences and outcomes of Black children, and to expand educational opportunity for Black students, families, and communities throughout the United States and the world. In 2017, Tom awarded what was then called the Research Center for Black Education and Leadership a seed grant in the amount of $20,000 before it was popular to fund projects such as this. And in just 5 years, BERC, as we know it today, will be planted and cultivated into a university-based research center positioned to examine, assess, and transform education as we know it today. And so, Tom, I just wanted to thank you again for your support and leadership. The History and Education program at Teachers College during the fall and spring semesters comes together for a discussion of research and teaching topics in history and education. And featured speakers have included Dr. Duchess Harris of Macalester College, Dr. Judith Weisenfeld of Princeton University, and Dr. Jonathan Rosa at Stanford University. And tonight we're delighted to have Dr. Jarvis Givens from Harvard University, who will join us in a moment. Before I bring up Dr. Givens, I would also like to acknowledge and thank our event host, the Schomburg Center for Research and Black Culture, including its director, Joelle Bivens, Kadia Tubman, who is the manager of education programs and outreach. And I'd also like to take a personal privilege to acknowledge the advisory board members of the Black Education Research Center who have joined us this evening. With us tonight, we have Dr. M. Christopher Brown II, please stand. We have Dr. Joyce King, who has also joined this evening. Dr. Kofi Lomote. And Dr. Rosa Rivera McCutcheon. And Naja. Hey, Naja. I'd also like to recognize Dr. Dawn Brooks DaCosta, who is the Deputy Superintendent of District 5 of the New York City Department of Education, for joining us in her leadership and work here in Harlem. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our very special guest, Professor Jarvis Givens. Jarvis R. Givens is an Associate Professor of Education in African and African American Studies at Harvard University. He's the author of Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson and the Art of Black Teaching, Harvard University Press, 2021, and School Clothes, a collective memoir of Black student witness, Beacon Press, February 2023. Professor Givens recently prepared new editions of 2 African-American classics, Carter G. Woodson's The Miseducation of the Negro, to be published by Penguin Classics, and Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery, to be published by the Norton Library. In partnership with Imani Perry of Princeton University, he is also the principal investigator of the Black Teacher Archive, a digital humanities project sponsored by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and focused on preserving the political and intellectual legacy of Black school teachers before 1970. Professor Givens is a native of Compton, California, and currently resides in Roxbury, Massachusetts. Please welcome to the stage Dr. Jarvis Givens.
All right, it's good to see you all here today. I must say, we were preparing to come out, I was just sitting and thinking about when I first started doing research on the history of Black education before I came to New York to visit the Schomburg for the first time. I remember reading about this place and listening to, John Henrik Clarke's A Great and Mighty Walk when he talks about arriving in New York and meeting folks like Willis Nathaniel Huggins and other folks that were at the Schomburg, similar to Sonya Sanchez, and how this was a very transformative place for those very important thinkers. And when I started doing my dissertation research, and it brought me here to have to look at materials that the Schomburg had on Black teachers and their engagement with Carter G. Woodson's ideas, that was very important to me, to feel like I was looking through these papers and seeing letters between Arturo Schomburg and Carter G. Woodson, but to now be here to be able to share the work that is the product of those years and labor is really special. So I appreciate BERC and also the Schomburg for inviting me to be here today to share these comments with you. So we're gonna be talking a lot about the new book that I just published, but I felt like it was important to talk a little bit about my journey getting to the book, School Closed, writing about the history and the experiences of Black students. So in order to talk about that, I feel like I have to say a little bit about the first book as well, Fugitive Pedagogy. And so my desire for a new interpretation of Black educational history actually began with the textbook. I came across a passing reference to Carter G. Woodson's textbooks, one of which you see pictured on the screen here, being read by a group of junior high students in New Orleans during the 1930s. I knew Woodson to be a famed historian, the child and student of formerly enslaved people, and the second African-American to receive a PhD from Harvard in 1912. I was also familiar with his most iconic book, The Miseducation of the Negro, which, as Sonya mentioned, I recently edited for Penguin Classics, making it the first time that this classic text has been published by a mainstream press since its original release in 1933, 90 years ago this year. Thanks. But while I was familiar with all of these aspects of Woodson's intellectual legacy, the story of him writing textbooks between 1922 and 1950 and their wide circulation among African-American teachers posed a narrative problem for me, because it challenged an impoverished framing of African-American education based on institutional and ideological histories documenting the history of separate and unequal schooling, right? And many of us are familiar with the images of dilapidated Black school buildings, so on and so forth. While indeed factual, those histories revealed only part of the story. They failed to remember the art of Black teaching, which I wrote about in my first book, and a legacy that was represented by those very textbooks published by Carter G. Woodson. And while I was impressed with Woodson's contributions, I became mostly concerned with the tradition of teaching that he represented. And it was the story of one educator in particular that forced me to confront the broader social history of Black teaching that made Woodson's intellectual labor so impactful. And her story is largely undetectable in traditional educational records, instead existing in otherwise places requiring the work of archival assembly, which for me reflects the discovery, preservation, and at times rearrangement of historical collections to address erasure and archival silences. So I want to turn to the opening scenario of fugitive pedagogy to frame the remainder of the introductory comments that I'll share today. And so as I mentioned, the comments that I'm going to share is going to focus on fugitive pedagogy, but then I'm going to do a quick pivot to talk about the new book and how it grows out of this first work. So this first part I'm calling Assembling a Fugitive Archive on Black Teaching. Tessie McGee read to her class in a steady, measured tone, quietly engaging in a calculated act of subversion. She was Black, 28 years old, and she taught history in 1933 at the only Black secondary school in Webster Parish, Louisiana. The all-white Department of Education and local school board gave very clear instructions. Teachers were to keep the pre-approved outline openly displayed on their desks, which they were to follow closely to acquaint their students with the targeted learning objectives. Black educators and families in Webster Parish had little formal control over curriculum, yet on many occasions, Ms. McGee made what she deemed to be necessary revisions to the mandatory curriculum. Based on her own judgment, and perhaps at the recommendation of fellow Black teachers, she often read passages from Carter G. Woodson's book on the Negro, which rested comfortably in her lap. She kept this textbook out of sight, understanding that if she were to be caught, she would be vulnerable to the disciplinary practices of Jim Crow authorities. But she was undeterred. One of Ms. McGee's students from that year recounted, quote, "She read to us from that book. When the principal would come in, she would simply lift her eyes to the outline that resided on the desk, and she began teaching us from the outline. When the principal disappeared, her eyes went back to the book in her lap," end quote. Tessie McGee's method of instruction constitutes a textbook example of what I came to call fugitive pedagogy. Fugitive pedagogy consists of African Americans' physical and intellectual acts that explicitly challenged anti-Black protocols of educational domination, actions that often took place in discreet or partially concealed fashion. And my use of this term, fugitive, draws inspiration from the historical archetype of the fugitive slave, who emerged as a folk hero in the curricular imaginations of Black teachers. I would learn that as early as 1890, African American school teachers wrote textbooks filled with heroic narratives about enslaved Blacks who absconded from plantations, those who led slave revolts, and stories about maroon communities in the dismal swamps of Virginia, Suriname, Brazil, and Jamaica. And it was also clarifying to learn that the very first Black-authored textbooks were actually written by fugitive slaves. James W.C. Pennington, an escaped slave from Maryland who became a teacher at the African Free School in Connecticut, inaugurated this tradition in 1841. And William Wells Brown would follow in his footsteps. So what I'm saying here is that my conceptualization of fugitive pedagogy names a phenomenon that surfaced within the archive at multiple levels, right? It's more than just an elaborate metaphor. What's more, the concept is drawing a narrative line from enslaved Black people's defiance of anti-literacy laws that criminalize Black education to the actions of educators like Tessie McGee in the post-emancipation era. And fugitive pedagogy was a collective endeavor, even when manifesting as individual acts of practice, like the case of Tessie McGee. For instance, the principal entering her classroom was a Black man named J.L. Jones. And record suggests that Principal Jones supported the inclusion of Black history and culture at Webster Parish, right? How do we know this? We know this because we learned that he was a leading member in the Louisiana Colored Teachers Association, which had explicitly endorsed Carter G. Woodson and his work. This is one of many documents from the Louisiana Colored Teachers Association where the school that Tessie McGee works at appears in the journal, and so does the principal. And this organization worked very closely with Woodson, similar to various other states across the country with Black teacher organizations. But in addition to this, We know that Woodson appeared regularly on the programs at the annual meetings of Black teacher associations at both the state and national level. So given this context, right, knowing that Woodson was a life member in the National Association of Teachers in Colored Schools, seeing his appearance at these Black teacher meetings in Tennessee and Louisiana and all these other places, and the principal's involvement with this, it is not implausible then to consider that Principal Jones and Miss McGee may have very likely conspired together. The principal testing the teacher to ensure that she could protect herself and the school if a white official entered the room. Because Black educators walked a tightrope when challenging such oppressive schooling contexts. If they were to fall or be caught, there was no safety net to catch them. So what I'm saying is that Black teachers were routinely targeted and fired for challenging white authority. And just a couple of examples in case someone feels I might be overstating this point here, right? Just a few years prior, this is an example of the local white school board in Oklahoma, in Muskogee, Oklahoma, learning that Woodson's textbooks were being used in the Black high school, right? The books are confiscated, the teachers are reprimanded, and the principal is threatened with his life and forced to resign. And there are several other cases where we know of prominent Black teachers being fired for their political activism or for challenging white authority, right? Ida B. Wells, before she rises to national prominence, is fired as a teacher in Memphis, Tennessee in the 1890s. Anna Julia Cooper and John Davison fired and demoted from schools that they were leading in the early 20th century. And of course, the iconic case of Septima Clark. And there were also teachers who lost more than their jobs, right? Early on in the civil rights movement, we know teachers Harry and Harriet Moore were fired in 1946 and later killed when their home was bombed in Mims, Florida. So I'm painting this because I think it's important for us to appreciate the context, the social context and the political context that Black teachers and students during this time period are operating in. And so after learning about that network connection between the principal and the Louisiana Colored Teachers Association, I decided to seek out more of these records of Colored Teachers Association across the country to assess the reach of Woodson's influence, right? This is another excerpt from the Louisiana Colored Teachers Journal, where we see teachers across the state of Louisiana organizing themselves into study groups in the 1930s to infuse their curriculum with scholarship on Black life and culture being published by Black scholars. But I wanted to seek out more of these materials to be able to document the breadth and depth of this story. But locating these materials proved more challenging than I expected. What I found after traveling to more than a dozen states and Washington, D.C., was deeply concerning. Some records were cataloged and easy to access, but the majority were unprocessed or existed in bits and pieces scattered across multiple historical repositories and personal collections. Sometimes I was told the materials did not exist after driving from New Orleans to Jackson, Mississippi on a hunch, only for a near complete collection to be discovered in an old plastic bin rotting away in a closet. Sometimes the journals of Colored Teachers Association sat on shelves in libraries as ordinary reference material despite their fragility and historical significance. So recognizing the disorderly nature of this archive, I decided that my work as a scholar included the custodial task of securing the long-term preservation of these collections, to insist that an archive remains for subsequent generations of scholars who will exceed my work and indeed my lifetime. So since 2018, I've been building the Black Teacher Archive, which entails locating, cataloging, and digitizing the serial journals and publications of Colored Teachers Associations. This digital archive will launch in September 2023, and it will be an open access online portal. The BTA will be the largest digital repository of material on African American teachers in education. Thank you. And as you can see here, I'm working with my friend and thought partner, Professor Imani Perry, and Micah Broadnex, who's an excellent archivist, has really been helping us bring this project into life. But the BTA consists of more than 50,000 pages of written material by African American school teachers. And based on our estimates, there were approximately 2,500 issues of Colored Teacher Association journals that were published. And of this number, we've located, digitized, and processed just under 1,900 issues. And the publication dates range from 1907 to 1973, and the journals, representing 15 states and Washington, D.C., were collected from more than 60 repositories. I'm not going to get into too much of the technical aspects. Sorry, this is more information about the BTA in particular. But happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. But one of the things that I want to emphasize at this point as I pivot to the new project is that my assembly of the Black Teacher Archive began with Tessie McGee, a story I found unexpectedly. It was a video recording of Miss McGee's student preserved in a personal collection at a church in Prince George's County, Maryland. McGee's story reminded me that Black teachers, students, and school communities have histories that can be traced back, and that their stories are worthy of thick description, and that to do so requires the assembly of new archives that provide windows into the interior life of Black education. This I was reminded of not in a research methods seminar, not while visiting the Library of Congress, not while studying special collections at an HBCU or the Schomburg. It was not retrieved from box files and folios in a quiet, pristine university library. I found these lessons in a fugitive archive tucked away in a crawl space of a storage room at a Black Baptist church. So now to the new work. As I mentioned, it was a student perspective that led to my conceptualization of fugitive pedagogy and my assembly of a fugitive archive. The 16-year-old Jerry Moore, who took note of Miss McGee as she removed her mask of compliance, documenting how, quote, her eyes went back to the book in her lap, end quote. Black students were always watching. While the field of education is, in theory, a student-centered enterprise, in practice, our writing about the history of education has not centered student perspectives. The field has mostly focused on the history of institutions, curriculum and ideologies, major theorists, and reform movements. However, recognizing the significant contribution student narratives made to my first book, I decided to build my second monograph around the voices of Black students. So School Clothes, a collective memoir of Black student witness, explores what it has meant to be a Black student in the American school. It relies on more than 100 student narratives across the 19th and 20th centuries to explore key themes in the history of Black education. Things like debates about intelligence, conflicts between education and racial capitalism, desegregation, literacy, political activism, and more. School Clothes is a reconstruction of Black educational history from a student perspective. For so long, Black students have been written about and held under a microscope, picked and prodded as specimen for study. They have been held in prolonged gaze, and rarely have those gazing felt the risk of Black students looking back. But Black students have always been watching and speaking and writing and singing, striving to give an account of themselves and the entangled relations structuring their social worlds. So across a range of scattered historical materials, we find Black students insisting that they have always been more than mere objects of history, but instead its subjects. School Clothes is about students witnessing as a mode of Black study. The book is made up of hand-me-down stories, pieces of memory passed on, stitched together, and offered as something to be taken up again as though for the first time. And I call this a collective memoir because the individual stories become a communal utterance. School clothes foregrounds the chorus comprised of shared voices and shared vulnerability. So here is an assembly of students across time and space. A poem on slavery, written in 1828 by George Allen, a 12-year-old student at the African Free School in New York City. George handed in a written assignment that was so striking, the white schoolmaster questioned its authenticity and subsequently required George, whom he described as, quote, a very black boy of pure African descent, end quote, to produce a piece of poetry on any subject he pleased. The schoolmaster proceeded to lock George in a room for 30 minutes, forcing him to prove his ability. A ritual of validation resembling the trials of Phyllis Wheatley, an enslaved girl who became the first African American and woman to publish a book of poetry in the United States. And as many of us in here are probably familiar, in 1772, Wheatley would be forced to stand trial before a panel of 18 of Boston's most distinguished men, nearly all of whom owned slaves, to prove her intellectual capacity. But such exams were always about much more than proving their individual intelligence, but instead the assessment of an entire race. A song, Lift Every Voice and Sing, written by school principal James Weldon Johnson, but sung publicly for the first time by 500 black students in the year 1900. The song spread across the country, eventually becoming what we know as the Black National Anthem. But as Principal Johnson explained, quote, it was the school children of Jacksonville, Florida, who kept singing the song. Some of them went off to other schools and kept singing it, he says. Some of them became school teachers and taught it to their pupils, end quote. This song is a cultural artifact embodying the migration narrative of black pedagogy, one where generations of black students are vessels ensuring its survival. A memoir by Ida Mae Holland of Greenwood, Mississippi, a child of the 1940s and 50s who describes white education officials shortening the black school year calendar to ensure that the hands of African American children were available to pick cotton. Ida Mae also recounts exchanging lurid stories in the bathroom with classmates about things that they witnessed while working as domestics in the homes of white families. She details the distinct vulnerabilities black girls experience in such places, a kind of race and gendered violence that she knew all too well. As one other student emphasized, black families' awareness of such stories increased their fervor for education, writing, quote, they wanted for us emancipation from ditch digging, the wash tub, the domestic service, and menial labor in general, end quote. Ida Mae Holland echoes assessments by contemporary scholars like Saidiya Hartman, who assert that domestic work for black girls continued to carry the stain of slavery through the Jim Crow era, declaring that the kitchen was the field and the brothel, still a carryover from the house of bondage. Ida Mae's witnessing provides a searing account of racial capitalism's intrusion in the lives of Southern African American students and black girls in particular. A letter written in 1951 by a highly literate 10-year-old Yvonne Hutchinson, my former AP English literature teacher, to her grandmother, Mama Sissy, back home in Hot Springs, Arkansas. Yvonne describes her experiences attending an integrated elementary school in Los Angeles, having just moved from Arkansas, where she had attended the Frederick Douglass School. Yvonne is amazed that black people can sit wherever they want on the buses. And most of all, that, quote, here in California, they let Negroes go in the library, end quote. She also details with great joy seeing an issue of Jet magazine for the very first time, declaring to Mama Sissy that, quote, all the people in it are colored. And most of them are real famous people, like the singer Nat King Cole and that boxer Joe Louis, end quote. Assembly is a loaded word in the history of Black education. For indeed, the criminalization of Black assembly has long been a marker of African Americans' civic estrangement. My gathering of student voices refuses a legacy of anti-assembly laws and social customs in the United States. Such prescriptions anticipated anti-literacy laws. For instance, colonial Virginia established its very first anti-assembly law in 1723. This became a state law in 1804 and was later revised in 1819 to explicitly prohibit, quote, meetings or assemblages of slaves at any school or schoolhouse for teaching them reading or writing, either in the day or night, end quote. Whether it be an assembly of Black learners during slavery, an assembly of civil rights protesters, an assembly of Black students sitting together at the cafeteria table, standing on a corner after school, at a park on the weekend, or the assembly of activists to protest police killings of unarmed African Americans, the right to assembly for Black people has always been a contested privilege. My work of assembling an archive filled with Black student narratives is informed by the weight of this past. By looking back, African American students cast a Black gaze on the historical record that reveals the violence of the world around them. Yet these students' insistence on remembering and passing on accumulated knowledge also reveals the beauty they encountered, the lessons they learned, the songs they sang, and the freedom dreams they manifested. Because when gathered together, these artifacts become much more than just a collection of past material, but instead an anticipation for a collective memory to awaken. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Givens. Thank you for that presentation, which I think is very helpful to help frame the conversation that we're going to have about a little bit about fugitive pedagogy, but I think mostly about your most recent work, School Clothes. You referenced why you describe this work as a collective memoir. Can you talk more about the metaphor of school clothes and how it frames the book?
Yeah. The idea came to me. I was actually working on the first book, and I remember I was at Fisk looking for these journals about trying to trace Carter G. Woodson's relationship to Black teachers in the archive there. But I came across this interview I often end up wandering around and looking at things that I'm actually not there supposed to be looking at. But I feel like that happens to folks at the Schomburg all the time. But I came across an interview between Charles Johnson, the Black sociologist, and Mary McLeod Bethune, and she's talking about her experience in the late 19th century as a teenage girl among a community of sharecroppers in South Carolina, and she finds out that a local teacher helped secure support for her to go to school, to continue her learning beyond South Carolina. So she goes to Scotia Seminary. And she talks about this Black farming community stopping work to send her off to go to school. And she describes in great detail all of these clothes that they gave her. And I thought about that and I was like, oh, this is a really beautiful story. This is like so interesting. And I kept finding myself going back to that interview. But then I found a lot of narratives about Black students in the late 19th century going to school for, on the other side of slavery. And the language that they were using to describe dressing up and kind of working to kind of assert themselves in a new way, I just found like, you know, it resonated with all sorts of narratives that I had, whether it be the images we have of the Little Rock Nine, you know, dressed to the nines to desegregate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. And so that's kind of where the story came from. And I just started seeing all of these different references in the historical record, and I thought, you know, for me going to school, school clothes were very important, but it gave me a different way to think about that.
How many of you can relate to that with school clothes being important? You had your school clothes, church clothes, your play clothes, which you referenced in the book, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of pressure getting dressed for this talk today.
Oh,
based
no,
on the focus, the sartorial focus.
Yeah.
No, it's just really powerful. Again, I mean, I think overall the book and this focus on Black student voices as witness. Can you just elaborate more about, I guess, some of the key takeaways or things that you gained from being in the archives and really being able to, you know, in many ways engage with the experiences of Black students across time?
Yeah, and you know, and even, so like, even with the language of, right, it's not just, the school clothes language became more than just an idea about, and the book is not about school clothes. I mentioned it in the like framing of it and then in the conclusion, but the meat of the book is not actually about clothing, but it's really about these stories of Black students that I feel like can offer a covering for Black students in the contemporary moment, right? But I also felt like the language that they were writing about and reflecting on, you know, clothing, I think I can think about the story of William Holtzclaw that's in the conclusion of the book, where he talks about needing to have these white clothes for this culminating school event, and he talks about his family him not having it, and his mother cutting up her petticoat, which is this undergarment, to make 3 suits for her children. He writes about this in his memoir. But for me, the language of school clothes came to take on a symbolic value, right? Is this kind of, it represents not just the physical clothing, but the fact that these students were being covered in dreams, right? And visions of a new future that they were trying to go out and to enact. So the language takes on that kind of metaphorical and symbolic significance. But even in thinking about the kind of voices of these students, it started to be, one of the things that I learned is that when I was writing it, it wasn't just about getting the story of an individual student right. I was really interested in listening and saying, okay, I'm writing about Charlotte Fortin, you know, in Boston and in Philadelphia, and then reading her diaries from the 1850s, and she's talking about seeing a fugitive slave captured and sent back to Virginia, and she's writing about this as a 16-year-old girl making sense of her own racialized identity, right? And then I came across narratives of Black students in, say, you know, the 20th century, talking about witnessing the kind of killing of Emmett Till, right? And certainly I could think about the contemporary moment. We can imagine with the kind of circulation of videos of, you know, police killings of unarmed African Americans. And for me, it became less about an individual story, but thinking about how Black students are documenting them coming into their own sense of identity in relationship to racial violence. And those are the kinds of things that I felt like I was able to see and hone in on by pulling the stories together in a particular way, right? And offering this kind of collage of student story narratives to say that it's about, you know, it's not compromising and saying they're not individual people, right? They are, right? We can pay attention to their distinctions, but there's also something to be said when we blur the lines and say there's a collective experience that they're experiencing as individual people that they've been documenting and that is important for us to write about.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm really struck by your approach, which you describe as archival assembly. Can you take us behind the scenes a little bit and tell us about your approach? You know, I'm interested in, and I'm sure many, well, I hope others are, around how you know, tell the stories of others who lived and experienced an era and a time that, that preceded you.
Yeah. Thanks for that question. This is a question about methods.
Research nerd.
Yeah, so, you know, my training as a historian comes from African American studies. So one of the first things that I'm very aware of are silences in the archival record. the fact that there are things that can and cannot be known, and particularly because, right, this center exists because folks like Arturo Schomburg and Carter G. Woodson and Vivian Harsh and all these important Black bibliophiles and librarians and archivists recognized the kind of neglect of sources documenting Black people's experiences in the historical kind of collections that we have to be able to go and access stories about the past. And so for me, and then, so that's one thing, right? Recognizing that there are silences that exist and that are manufactured in the process of historical research. But then I was also very aware of a lot of very important scholarship coming out that talks about what can and cannot be known in the archival record, and there's been a lot of work kind of turning away from archives because of their limitations. And while I found a lot of that work to be useful, I also realized that there's also still a lot of materials that do exist, right, that we actually need to make sure that we are preserving and actually using in new ways to be able to expand our knowledge and what we can know about the history of Black education or other fields as well. And so that idea of archival assembly is both me acknowledging the realization that silences do exist in the archive, but also still recommitting to pursuing material remnants of the past that allow us to access the voices and the experiences of, particularly Black teachers and students. Because these teachers, were very intentional about documenting some of these things and preserving records. And it's important for us to make sure that we don't abandon the project of making sure that those things are preserved and available for systematic study of, the Black educational heritage.
Thank you. What does it mean to translate Black educational history, and how do you do that even given your own experiences as a Black educator, a professor, and a former Black student yourself?
Yeah.
Well, not former Black, but...
Yeah, no, right, we're still Black. We're not post-Black here. I know some people write about that. I'm not one of them. But I will say that, so this is also back to your question about it being a collective memoir, right? I talked about it being a collective memoir in a methodological sense because it's collective in a sense that it's bringing together these individual stories of Black students and thinking about them in relationship to one another as a Black student body, so to speak, right? This kind of collective of a particular distinct group of students in American history. But the other part of this is I use the language of collective memoir because there's no way for me to write about the history of Black students without taking seriously my own experience as a Black student, right, and educator, but particularly someone who was the student of Black teachers my entire life, right? I had Black teachers from, essentially up until the time I went to college at UC Berkeley. All of my teachers were Black, right? From preschool through 8th grade, attended a small Black parochial school in Compton, California, that was originally all white when Compton as a city was all white, but then when Black folks moved in, white folks moved out, these Black folks appropriated this school that was there. And so much of what I was writing about in the first book about fugitive pedagogy was, things that I was noticing in the record, in part because it seemed sort of familiar in a particular way, right? So for me, translating the history of Black education has been, in some part, me choosing to lean into that part of my relationship or the intimacy between the historical research and my identity as, a student of Black teachers my entire life up and through, preschool, middle school, and high school. I included that narrative of my former high school teacher intentionally, even as I don't over-rely on my personal narrative in the story. I use it a little bit to frame certain things, but only to kind of position myself in relationship to the work, not to rely on it in excess, because I think what I was able to get from the historical record was sufficient, right? Or complemented my personal experiences in a really important way. But that's one of the things that I found to be important, is to not take a dispassionate approach to doing this kind of research, because I think that the work is way too important to kind of try to lean into some kind of very rigid idea of objectivity for the sake of proving myself or the work to somebody that I feel like if they're interested in doubling down on that are not really interested in the work for the reasons that I am anyway. So I think that translation work that I'm trying to do has to do with trying to speak to it in a very personal way and to talk about this history as not just a part of the past, but that it's a living history that can continue to be a resource in a lot of important ways.
Well, as I'm hearing you talk, and I wonder how many individuals have had a similar experience in terms of having Black teachers all throughout their PK-12 education, and if you're really the only person that could write this book. I mean, do you think that if someone didn't have those experiences, that they'd be able to tell the story in the same way?
You know, I don't. So this is interesting. So, two parts to this. So when I was in college, and I was took some courses on education. When I got to graduate school, and I got all of this literature about Black student underachievement and stuff, school to prison pipeline, and folks were, in class were like expecting me to be able to speak to it. I was like, I don't know what the heck that's about. Like, that's not my experience. I was like, I do not resonate with that. And it wasn't until I read Vanessa Siddle Walker's book, my very first year in graduate school, Their Highest Potential, about the Coswell County Training School. And I was like, oh, this seems way more familiar to what I know than this other stuff that I'm expected to relate to. So I started to realize then that I did realize that all of my peers at UC Berkeley, I see one of my line brothers here, right? When we were there, that many of the students that I was at Berkeley with did not have Black teachers their entire life. That they didn't grow up singing Lift Every Voice and Sing every morning from the time they were preschool up and through high school before school started every day. I was like, I thought that's what school was, right? But I quickly learned that that wasn't the case. So I'm saying, yes, I had that in the back of my mind, but it didn't really come into the work until particularly this book I leaned into that a bit more, in part because my colleague Imani Perry, who I'm working on with the Black Teacher Archive, she had read some early versions of Fugitive Pedagogy, and she said, you should really make sure that you don't undervalue how you as, the Black student as witness, right, are witnessing through your historical research process, right? And that's in part where this book the second book kind of comes from. That, and also, I don't know if folks know, but Dr. Teresa Perry is Imani Perry's mother, who's my neighbor in Roxbury, who also was saying, you really should write a book that's like building on this work you're doing on the history of Black education, but that's speaking to a kind of a broader audience beyond just the kind of first academic book. And we started talking and realized that the student perspective would be a very useful frame for writing the book. So maybe I was well positioned to do that work because of that personal experience and because it led me to do the work in certain ways with the first book and in those conversations. But I'm sure there are other folks that I've known that who resonate with the experience that I'm writing about. They might not be historians writing and doing historical research. So maybe of the, my cohort of scholars who are kind of, and also I'll say this. I know for a fact that people like Vanessa Siddle Walker and James Anderson also have a similar narrative, right? But I feel like I was able to write in a more, so James Anderson wrote The Education of Blacks in the South. I just mentioned Vanessa Siddle Walker, but they also had this kind of intimate relationship with the work that they were writing about, but perhaps because I was trained in African American studies, right? A scholar of a particular generation, maybe I was allowed to do work in ways that scholars before me may not have been able to.
That's a powerful point, important point. And your teachers did an amazing job, because I hope that you pick up a copy of the book. It's just beautifully written, as is most of, or all of, Dr. Given's work. So it's a testament to the Black teachers that he had in many ways. I want to talk more about how the book takes up the historical freedom struggle and the role that education plays, particularly for Blacks in the U.S., African Americans. And I'll say African Americans because I'm also curious as to your thoughts about how you conceptualize Black in your work, recognizing that that's even changing as the Black population in the U.S. is shifting with a lot more individuals who are immigrants or who weren't necessarily a part of the African American Civil Rights struggle in the U.S. So how does that shape or inform your work, if at all, given its focus on history?
Yeah, so I'll take that first part of the question, and then I'll come back to this larger question about how do I conceptualize blackness, which is a huge question. But I'll try to take a crack at it. I do think it's relevant for some parts of the work as well. But to this first part, one of the things in terms of black education and its relationship to the Black freedom movement, one of the things I felt like I was saying in the first book, but I might not have said it in a very heavy-handed way, is that there's no way for us to fully appreciate the civil rights movement without thinking about the Black teachers who cultivated dreams and those generations of Black leaders who led the movement, right? And what I'm doing in this second book is you see the appearance of so many of these important kind of Black political leaders and Black writers, whether it's Zora Neale Hurston, whether it's someone like John Lewis, who talks about his teachers in Troy, Alabama, right, and being exposed to Carter G. Woodson's Negro History Week as a child. His very first act, of civil rights protest is trying to register to get a library card in Troy, Alabama, before he goes and joins SNCC and things like that. And he talks about learning about the boycotts and the civil rights and things that are happening during the civil rights movement from his teachers, right, who are telling them these stories outside of the formal space of the classroom. And folks like James Weldon Johnson as well, very important early civil rights activists. So I'm trying to, I explicitly say it at particular moments, but I also just try to show in the narrative is you see all these people appear and you see, all that they're saying about this educational world that they're a part of, both them bearing witness to the kinds of harm and violence that they encountered, but also all of these intellectual and cultural resources that they're encountering and being equipped with that we then see them putting into practice, right, in their efforts to kind of lead the Black freedom movement in the Black Power era and in the civil rights movement before them. Folks like Angela Davis and Sonya Sanchez showing up in the book as students, right? They attended the same elementary school, right? Decades apart, but they talk about very similar experiences at Tuggle Elementary in Birmingham, Alabama, and their early exposure to histories of resistance and new ways of thinking against the grain despite the limitations of the formal curriculum that Black teachers in Alabama were being offered. So that's what I feel like I'm saying about the relationship between these student narratives and in the first book, the teachers, to the Black freedom struggle, is that we've underappreciated the central role of education, and not just higher education, but K through 12 education as an important kind of training ground for the civil rights movement in all sorts of ways. So that's one of the things that I would say about that. And then to this other question, I think for me, I'm writing about the particularities of, the African American experience in the U.S., but I know, but my understanding, just like the understanding of folks like Carter G. Woodson and these teachers, right, when I put up those slides, when they're talking about, even though they're targeting Black folks in the U.S., we see Brazil popping up. We see, Suriname. We see Jamaica, right? We see the narrative of Haiti showing up, well before even Woodson's textbooks, but these Black teachers in the 19th century writing about, Black education through what I'll borrow from, Dr. Joyce King here, a diaspora literacy being enacted through the way that they're conceptualizing their identities and the way that they're working to rewrite the system of knowledge that is diasporic in scope. Because, anti-Blackness is not just a reality in the US. It's something, the kind of violence that Black Americans experience in the US historically has always been about the kind of distorted and curricular violence that also happened when we think about representations of the continent, right? And the justifications that were used, to legitimize slavery. It's always about the system of knowledge and the stories that have to be told about these people collectively. That is never just about any singular kind of national context. And anytime that we study Black history and take it seriously, we have to, reckon with that, even as there are particularities from one place to the next, whether this is in London or in the US, right? I remember in one of the chapters of my first book, there's a section where I'm reading the miseducation of the Negro in relationship to writings by folks like Sylvia Wynter, Bernard Cord in the UK, who wrote How the West Indian Child is Made Educationally Subnormal, where we see so many similarities about the kind of marginalization of black students, and particularly dark-skinned black students in particular ways that resonate across these contexts. So that's my, I'm always thinking about, blackness in that kind of diasporic context, and recognizing that even as we can still take seriously the differences across linguistic contexts and the different colonial histories that exist, we can hold both of those things at the same time and take seriously anti-blackness as a structuring kind of phenomenon in the modern world that transcends one particular place.
Thank you. So this might give us an opportunity to talk a little bit about, there's lots of controversies happening around what can be taught in schools and debates over the teaching of race and history. And I'm thinking about the AP African American Studies course that the College Board has developed, and you were on the advisory board for that work. Can you talk a little bit about your experience with that and just again, the process and the decisions that are made and how we get that content into the hands of more children?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I was, and I think it was the summer of 2021. Dr. Brandy Waters, who got her PhD, is also in African American Studies, who I had known since undergrad. In African American Studies and Latin American history, right? Had reached out and said that, I found out she was going to be the director of this new AP African American Studies initiative, and knowing Brandy, a scholar that I absolutely respect, like, oh, this is great. Would love to be kind of a part and figure out how to support. So I was a part of the writing team in 2021, and then joined the development committee up and through 2022. I had transitioned off in the fall of 2022 for a number of reasons. I kind of had to take a step back. So the past few months I wasn't super involved with it in terms of the piloting year. But one of the things that I would say is that, I still am excited about what's happening with the course because, as I mentioned in the conclusion of my first book, one of the things that I felt like African American Studies as a field has kind of dropped the ball on is the kind of engagement with black education in the K-12 context. And what I saw in the historical record, when we look at folks like Carter G. Woodson, Du Bois, Mary McLeod Bethune, right, and these K-12 teachers sharing intellectual space in these colored teachers associations, we saw this exchange of intellectual ideas between kind of higher ed and K-12 settings because they understood the kind of clear relationship between them. And I don't know that African American Studies in the more recent years has taken seriously the kind of responsibility to education that happens in the K-12 level. That's something I experienced as someone who got a PhD in African American Studies. I felt like it was underrepresented. We don't always prioritize getting scholars of education in African American Studies the way that we might a literature scholar or religion scholar, so on and so forth. So that's to say, I thought it was a great opportunity to come together with, we were writing, it was high school teachers and scholars in African American Studies across institutions across the country, and so that was a very exciting moment. I'd never experienced anything like that before. Now, when the commentary came out from, the governor in Florida that, African American Studies lacks any educational value, of course I was immediately infuriated. As someone who has a PhD in African American Studies, I obviously see that comments directly related to the kinds of anti-black ideas of, the kind of professors that Woodson encountered at Harvard University when he was a history student there, the kinds of school leaders that folks like Tessie McGee would have been up against, right? We can trace a through line between that. I was also frustrated that the College Board took so long to actually say anything publicly in response to that. But overall, I think the course, what was created and what I know of it, and having seen introductory syllabi for African American Studies across, universities across the country, from what I know that the team of folks that came together, the scholars that came together and the teachers, it's much more kind of, covers more breadth and depth than most of any of the other intro African American Studies courses that I've seen. And even as I say that, right, this is not a kind of valorization of the College Board at all. I think it's a testament to Brandy Waters and her efforts and her labor in bringing those folks together. And certainly the course is not perfect, but I don't think the conversation should ever begin or end with anything that the College Board is doing around African American studies. There should have been more effort around that work before API-FAM and certainly well after. So that's what I would say to that.
Thank you, well said. There's plenty, I think we have, and we're doing some of this work at BERC, and I think our advisory board, who I think reflects, again, the opportunity for higher education faculty and K-12 education faculty to be able to work together to figure out how we actually get this content into schools. And so we're actually doing this work with the Department of Education in developing the first PK-12 interdisciplinary Black Studies curriculum for New York City.
It's exciting.
So I just, it's an exciting time, an historic time. We just want to encourage everyone, to support these efforts because it's something I know I wish I had as a student, and it's exciting to think that young people will be able to have that experience going forward. Okay. Do I have time for one more question? Okay. I wanted to talk a little bit about Black educational studies and the work that you're doing. To really, I guess, shore this up as a field of study, could you talk about what is included in Black educational studies?
Yeah, so I think, this is kind of coming from something I was hinting at a little earlier where I felt like in African American studies, there was an underappreciation for thinking about its relationship to the history of Black education, before the establishment of Black studies programs in like the late 1960s and stuff like that. But also, so wanting to kind of build this bridge between Black studies and education studies in a more intentional and systematic way. And also trying to develop some protocols around what it means to study Black education in a rigorous way, whether you be in a school of education or whether you be in an African American studies department, the way that we have Black literary studies, right? Or Black performance studies, right? Where you have, a bringing together of a very long body of kind of scholarship that actually does exist. One of the things that I enjoy teaching in one of my graduate seminars on Black studies and education research, there is this, it's an unpublished manuscript by James Anderson on the Black education professoriate, where he writes about, he's essentially, it's a kind of an annotated bibliography of all of these Black doctorates in education from the kind of, 1920s and then, up and through until the 1980s. And he looks at this transformation where you start to see in the kind of mid-20th century that education doctorates become the largest percentage of kind of earned doctorate degrees for Black folks, both because of the kind of intentional funding by certain kind of white philanthropic organizations, but also that there is this very rich body of scholarship that had existed there, right? But, I feel like that was underappreciated in the field of Black studies, and I would even say in the field of education research, even though we have so many important, wonderful scholars that, like, some of the folks that we've mentioned in this conversation, but trying to do work to kind of pull that work together and say there is a way of systematically studying Black education that requires engaging with the work of folks like James Anderson, right, Jacqueline Irving, Joyce King, and so many of these folks, thinking about questions around literacy and thinking about Geneva Smitherman's work, that if we don't pull this kind of work together and say there's a very long intellectual tradition in the field of education, and that intellectual tradition precedes the formal establishment of Black studies and actually has an intimate relationship to the origins of Black studies that we haven't appreciated. So I see it as a conversation on both sides, thinking about how we build on the conceptual resources from Black studies to shape a more systematic way of thinking about the study of Black education, but also thinking about this intellectual legacy of kind of Black scholars in the field of education, and also many of these, like Woodson, right? Like so many of these early school teachers who were doing a lot of the important work and laying the groundwork for many of the texts that we read in Black studies, right? How do we make sense of Zora Neale Hurston without thinking about the educational context that she came from, right? So many of the important Black writers, whether it's James Baldwin talking about the influence of his Black teachers here in New York. The fact that we write about and talk about the Harlem Renaissance. How do we appreciate the Harlem Renaissance without thinking about the fact that the first event kicking it off was a book launch for Jessie Fawcett, a school teacher, right? So it's trying to assert the kind of centrality of the history of education to the very project of Black Studies, while also saying that we can't fully have a sharp social analysis of anti-Blackness without understanding it as a problem of education and the system of knowledge, right? If we think folks like Sylvia Wynter write about this in very important ways about the role of kind of curriculum and the system of representation as the foundation for these ideas that are then put into practice in policies and Jim Crow laws and all this stuff. It's always anti-Blackness is always fundamentally an educational problem, and I think that that's an important lesson that is important in the context of education, but also Black studies. And so I see Black education studies as making that kind of intervention in some important ways.
Me too. Me too. So we have about 15 minutes for Q&A. And I just have one quick question as we wait for the first person to ask a question. What would you like, because we have some doctoral students in here, I know. What would you like to see in terms of the work that you're doing with the Black Teacher Archive? And how do you see that, potentially fueling, future research studies? What would you like to see in the next 5 or 10 years as a result of the archive?
I feel like my mind is kind of all over the place with that one, because I'm like just realizing all the time that there are so many different things that are going to be possible with the archive that's now assembled. Just even things like just being able to search the name of there are all these very prominent Black teachers who, in local context, but also that traveled across states and things like that, that we'll be able to see these connections across state lines in ways that we haven't been able to before, because we'll be allowed to kind of do in-text searching against this now kind of 50,000 pages of written material by Black teachers, across the greater part of the 20th century. But the kinds of questions that we'll be able to ask against that archive, are all infinite, right? I was looking at an article where it's like Mary McLeod Bethune visiting these young people in prisons, right? So even if we were to just do something like search prisons or something like that in the archive to see all this stuff that people are writing about, kind of carceral study, the intersection between carceral studies and education, but being able to kind of look in this collection for some of these themes early on as a kind of a historical basis for thinking through some of these systems that have very long roots that can actually be traced back, and that we see Black teachers documenting in all kinds of ways. And there are all sorts of analyses and things that people can kind of do with that work. But I'm interested in writing a number of things that will engage with it, but I'm sure that there are students that will ask all kinds of questions that I can't even think to imagine against the material, and that's exciting.
Very exciting, indeed. Thank you.
Because it is being taped. We have 15 minutes for questions and answers.
I think we talked too long.
Get my questions.
Hi, thank you for being here, and thank you for this work that you're doing. I'm a second-year doc student at Columbia Teachers College, and I'm getting my doctorate actually in curriculum and teaching, and focusing specifically on African-centered education, thanks to the work of Dr. Kofi Lamodi and also Dr. Joyce King. And so one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is family and education together, especially as we conceive it, especially as we think about our lineage as African people and the way that we did education as a holistic, as a lived experience. And so I'm wondering, how did parents, in the archive, when you're looking at teachers and looking at students, how did parents and community show up in terms of education and the way that they interacted and were interconnected in that type of education that they were giving, that you were looking at?
Thank you for that question. That was a very important kind of theme that came up in a number of ways, right? Whether I think about, for instance, Carter G. Woodson, me taking Woodson seriously as a thinker required me to think critically about his own familial experience, right? His first teachers in a one-room schoolhouse were his formerly enslaved uncles. And, you know, while that was something I had come across in a very passing reference in many of the earlier biographies on him, for me, I was like, how do we not sit with that and really mine what that means for the person that becomes the quote-unquote, you know, father of Black history, if we want to use that title, who went to, schools, and then and also the high school that he went to, the principal of the high school was his cousin, who he saw fired because he ran an independent Black newspaper that was trying to run an independent slate of candidates in West Virginia. So the intimacy between the schoolhouse and Woodson's familial life for me very early on became a very important place for thinking about that. But even that story with Tessie McGee, right, is another example in that Louisiana Colored Teachers Journal that I shared. I know we couldn't read the article. That article is actually documenting this kind of community effort to raise money by cultivating neighborhood patches of cotton to raise money to offer as matching funds to the Rosenwald Foundation, right? Many people think of these Rosenwald schools that modernized Black schools as coming from, Julius Rosenwald, this very important kind of wealthy man who just wanted to kind of fund, Black education. But in actuality, the greater story there is about the kind of double taxing that these farming communities did to raise money, sometimes more than the money they received from Julius Rosenwald, even though those schools are called Rosenwald schools, right? But that was an example of this kind of community of parents that cultivated this neighborhood patch of cotton to turn over funding in order to raise money to build a modern school structure. And even as I say that, there's a level of that we have to read even that in a complicated way, because we might want to kind of celebrate the kind of self-determination and independence of this community, but that was also a moment where Black folks are having to double tax themselves, right, in order to pay for an educational opportunity that they should have already been, offered, right, as thinking about education as a, project of citizenship. But these are the ways that we see parents showing up in these partnerships between educators and parents in very important ways, right? Parents could advocate for things that individual teachers couldn't because the individual teachers would be fired and targeted. But if the parents collectively go and advocate for something after learning from the teacher and the principal about what they needed, right, we see these kinds of strategies happening. Vanessa Siddle Walker writes about that very delicately and importantly in her book, her kind of historical ethnography of this community about parents, teachers, and students at the Coswell County Training School in North Carolina. I think would be a useful frame for thinking about that question of family in these histories.
Thank you.
I'll be shorter in my next responses, I promise.
You ready for this, young man? Hey, I have the utmost respect for you.
Thank you.
Respect, dude. But now, here's my question.
Yeah.
I went to PS 100 in the Bronx. I went to IS 131 and Stevenson in the Bronx. And for Blacks and Puerto Ricans that wanted to get an education because they came from families that realized that knowledge is power, if they were studious and they studied and they talked intellectually, they were considered as wanting to be white, and they were bullied. At first, there was a minority of students that felt that way, that if you don't want to be educated, you talk white, you want to be white, and they were bullied. And then I was a substitute teacher in Boston from 1987 to 1989 and realized there was a large number of students that were not studying as much because to study and to talk white was you bullied. You were looked at as like, oh, you want to be white, you're a wannabe. And now I'm a teacher in Queens now. I haven't been in the United States since 1994, so I came back. Anyway, and the number is larger, so there are a lot of kids that don't want to be educated because they feel like, oh, you want to be white. You're talking white, and that's not good. They look down upon, you're frowned upon, and you're beat up for that. So during your research in your archives, was there a year, or was that did it always exist, or was there a time where they said, hey, that's, you understand my question, my brother?
I understand the question, yeah. I think that the acting white narrative, I think, is a very complicated one that requires a lot of unpacking. What I will say is that what the historical record makes very clear is that there has always been a model of schooling where high academic achievement was seen as consistent with the kind of highest expression of Black cultural identity. And these are the learning communities that we can study where we see a culture of achievement, where Black life and culture are at the basis and the foundation for it. I think some of the stuff that people refer to as kind of acting white, I think there are a number of things at play there that I think has to be unpacked. We don't have space to talk about it here. But there are a lot of important critiques of the kind of acting white literature in the field of kind of, education research that I think will help unpack that. But one of the things that I will say is that in the contemporary moment and historically, there have always been lots of models, where, Black students' identities were seen as consistent with kind of high academic achievement, right? That's the only thing I ever knew, right? In Compton, California, like there was a way of thinking about educational achievement, and being a Black kind of intellectual that was consistent with Black cultural traditions and Black ways of being. And I think that, it's not one or the other. I'm not going to say that what you're naming is not a phenomenon that might have some kind of, manifestations in particular ways, but it's not an essential kind of, it's a lot more complicated than like a single narrative. But that's what I would offer, is that there are lots of models where that is not the case. And I think it has to do with school communities and what it means for schools to intentionally build a kind of a culture of achievement that centers Black student identities. And that's a different model than what a lot of these schools you're referring to might be offering. I appreciate it. We want to get this next question over here. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I want to say thank you to the Schomburg Center and also to the BERC staff for making this possible. I'm a first-year PhD student at Teachers College in the History and Education program. My name is Jacoby Youngblood. And the question I have for you is, in your research here, have you noticed a difference in the way that the educational experience is differing for Black folks who come from the freedmen's lineage or free Black lineage? Do you see that happening? And I'm asking this question as someone who studies Reconstruction.
Yeah, so there is some important kind of distinctions there, but I haven't completely teased them out. But for instance, I referenced Charlotte Fortin, who comes from a free, kind of well-to-do Black family in Philadelphia in the first half of the 1800s. The fact that her family could choose to not send her to the segregated Black schools in Philadelphia is not a privilege that all Black folks in Philadelphia had, right? But one of the things that's important is that when Charlotte Fortin goes to kind of Boston, and I referenced that encounter when she's 16 years old, writing in her diary about her witnessing the experience of fugitive slaves, of this fugitive slave that's captured, is that there was a very clear awareness, even as there is a distinction in social class amongst Black folks, that there is this shared vulnerability, irrespective of social status, or one standing as free, or descendants of kind of free Blacks, or fugitive slaves in the North, right? So, for instance, in the African Free School in the 1830s, there's an account between very important kind of Black abolitionists, Alexander Crummell and Henry Highland Garnett. They're students at the African Free School. Henry Highland Garnett's family are fugitive slaves in the North, and Alexander Crummell is a 12-year-old boy, and he witnesses slave catchers coming to kind of essentially coming to detain his schoolmate and his family. He sees his friend's father jump from a 2-story window, and he talks about like there are those moments where even that there's these kind of distinctions. It's important to name those distinctions, but there's a very clear kind of way in which even free Black folks at that time period recognize their shared vulnerability with Black folks in bondage, especially when we think about narratives about free Black folks who were, unlawfully kind of sold into slavery. And there are certainly narratives of those that we see in places, whether it be, up and down the kind of eastern seaboard. Some of these first teachers in the Reconstruction period, Heather Williams' book called Self-Taught, African American Education in Slavery and in Freedom, and also Ronald Burchard's book, Schooling the Freed People. when he writes about these applications of all these black free folks from the North during the Civil War who are applying to go south to teach black folks, they're expressing this very clear sense of racial kinship, right? And understanding that even as they're free in the North, they're still treated as second-class citizens, and they understand that treatment as very much so bound up in the realities of chattel slavery, right? So that kind of political clarity comes through, and I think we can talk about both the distinctions of social class again, while also talking about the realities, that kind of bottom line of anti-blackness that cuts across those distinctions is one of the things that I will offer as a way of thinking about that.
I'll go next as he walks to the mic, if that's okay. Thank you. My name is Rakiatu. I'm a K-12 teacher and obsessed with teacher preparation programs. So in a world where teacher preparation programs were continuing the work of the Black Teacher Archive, what would that look like? What would teachers that are being put into the field, prepared for the field today, what would they be trained to do? What would they be able to do to continue this work and the legacy of Colored Teachers Association?
Yeah. Well, one of the first things is that in a teacher education program, they will be taught that you need to study the history of education in order to be like an effective teacher, because teacher education programs, don't really value and especially not even just the history of education, but particularly this legacy of this tradition of teaching that I'm writing about, is that teachers have to be encouraged to lean into the intellectual work of recognizing that, when shaping one's professional identity, we have to be intentional about what are the pedagogical traditions that are informing our practice and how we're showing up and how we're even conceptualizing the vocation of teaching, right? That can't be an ahistoric process. And that's one of the ways that I'm hoping that the Black Teacher Archive we're planning to develop some resources to partner with folks who do teacher education, to think about how it can be integrated into teacher education curriculums, but also into a lot of professional development opportunities with K-12 educators to kind of reflect on this history, think about their own practice, and engage in that kind of intellectual work that I think teachers are not really often allowed to do, right? The language of practitioners often distorts the intellectual work that being a teacher is actually about, right? Which is why I don't refer to the teachers in my book as practitioners, but I call them scholars of the practice, right? Because they're thinking and reflecting on what it is they're doing, the structures that they're navigating. They're writing curriculum, and they're engaging in this kind of active Black study of education because they have that kind of political clarity around what it is that they're doing. And they know that they're striving to be teachers that are set apart from the norms of what teachers are supposed to be based on the kind of, curriculum that are offered in teacher training programs. Sometimes even in HBCUs, we see some of these teachers kind of resisting some of that history when we think about the early history of HBCUs that were training a lot of these Black educators.
Hello. I just wanted to just say that, kids say the darndest things or ask the darndest questions. And, being around some kids with OpenAI and ChatGPT, artificial intelligence, the kids are beginning to ask questions to artificial intelligence that are mind-blowing, things that we would never even think to ask. And children would ask, tell me why Tessie McGee, the Black educator, chose not to teach from the curriculum. Artificial intelligence won't answer these questions. I apologize, but the artificial intelligence language model does not have access to personal motivations or actions of the individual. My question is when will artificial intelligence track the language of Jarvis Givens? Because there seems to be a problem with that. We're talking about ChatGPT, we're talking about 20, 30% of the workforce will be out of work behind this. And it will cure cancer, it will change climate, but it cannot answer why Tessie McGee did not choose to follow a curriculum. There's something wrong with that. And I tease all my white friends. I said it's behaving like a white guy. You know what I mean? that artificial intelligence in America behaves just like my white friends. I don't want to
Yeah.
get into that. I don't want to have it.
Yeah.
Let's not have this conversation. We always laugh about that. But I'm not saying this from a black perspective. I'm saying it from a human perspective. Something is wrong.
Yeah. Well, one, I would say, I think the work of Ruha Benjamin is really, I think, aligns with some of the questions that you're asking and the concerns that you raise. Her work like Race to Technology and all that kind of stuff that I think is really some of the kind of cutting edge work to help us think about this. This is not something I've thought about very deeply, but to your question, which I hear is coming from a place of thinking about the kind of loss of humanity or a humanistic approach to thinking about education in the world that we live in. I think that that's something that's very, very important in education in general. So much emphasis is always placed on efficiency, the kind of procedural aspects of education, and that there is a lot that gets lost when we don't kind of lean into the more humanistic aspects of what it is that we're supposed to be doing as folks engaging in an education that's supposed to be about a liberatory project, not just about becoming more efficient workers, right? Because really the move towards this kind of hyper efficiency and the technological drive to make things more efficient to kind of achieve certain kinds of results and outcomes is really kind of a part of something that we are always dealing with in schools as well when we think about how accountability is measured and what kinds of things are valued. It's not necessarily a humanistic approach to education that I think there's always been a tradition of black folks that have resisted, those kind of utilitarian approaches to thinking about education that I see this current iteration of technology as an extension of. And I think that history offers an important kind of critique of this for us to be mindful of. But all the particulars about AI and stuff, I can't really speak to it because I don't know as much, but I would say Ruha Benjamin's work, if I was to attempt to kind of read and study that systematically, is probably the work that I would go to help me make sense of that question that you just posed. Thanks.
Trying to get it down there. Okay. So I also am a doc student at TC, and I'm going to try and make this quick. You mentioned collaboration between admins and teachers, and this history in free black schools. But currently, I'm noticing a lot of combative relationships that exist between teachers and admins of color. So I'm curious what your take is on how has integration and perhaps the illusion of scholastic equality affected the enactment of fugitivity?
The enactment of
fugitivity or fugitive pedagogy.
Yeah, so I would say when I was writing fugitive pedagogy, I didn't really imagine that it was going to have such resonance in the contemporary moment. It was like before the anti-CRT stuff, so I kind of resisted the urge of making those kinds of claims. But it's become increasingly, harder to do that because so much of the contemporary moment resonates with stuff that I was writing about. But one of the things that I would say is that I think that the tradition of teaching that I'm writing about, that I called fugitive pedagogy in the book, still manifests in the context of a number of different classrooms. Right? I had teachers who I felt like were operating in this tradition, even if it wasn't in the same systematic way that the teachers that I was writing about in the historical record did, because of this networked world that they had created and maintained for more than a century that did become integrated out of existence. And I think that we're just starting to really, reckon with that moment of rupture and what was lost with those institutional networks that did so much important advocacy work and things like that. But certainly there are teachers that are still operating in this tradition, whether, they may not call it fugitive pedagogy intentionally or anything like that. I'm using that language because I'm trying to ground it in the specific history of the period of enslavement and the politics that developed there and carried through. But even if we were to go outside of the US, right, the story that I wrote about is
particular to the African American experience, but it's speaking to a larger human experience about how oppressed communities have historically navigated power in the context of structures of education, which is a story that's not only about education in the US, right? It's not only a story about education in a particular, era of time, right? We can go to thinking about the work that educators were doing during the kind of apartheid regime in South Africa, that were doing things that resonate, with things that I'm writing about how Black folks were navigating power in the context of school structures. And that's really what the story is about, even as there's some particularities to the narratives that they were using, the histories and the curriculums that they were developing, that, I think cut across time and space, and certainly into the present moment. There are folks that are operating in that way. But I would say the biggest thing is that it's not at the kind of scale and scope that we see with this kind of earlier historical moment with the kind of Black teacher associations and stuff that I wrote about. So we lost that infrastructure, and you have individual teachers doing some of this work oftentimes in isolation, which makes them even more vulnerable, whereas these institutional structures that existed before did a lot of advocacy work for teachers and to kind of protect them, and also to kind of create spaces for folks coming together to develop an intentional agenda around Black education that they could enact on a local level, but also at a national level, right? So I would say that rupture, that loss of that structured, networked world, and the kind of having to rely on these individual folks making decisions, or kind of smaller pockets of folks. And I think there's a lot we can learn about those institutions that were created that did a lot of important work. We can't appreciate the civil rights movement without thinking about the work that these Black teacher networks did in the shadows, and intentionally kept their work out of the public eye. And so that's one of the ways that I feel like some of that has been lost. And hopefully in studying this information, it can inform more practices about kind of collectively engaging in this work moving forward.
Okay, are we at time? Cassandra?
Excuse me?
Oh, go ahead.
Good evening. We want to say it's time to close. On behalf of our fearless leader, Dr. Sonya Douglas, our advisory board of the Black Education Research Center, we want to say thank you for coming. Dr. Jarvis Givens, we want to say we honor you. We thank you for your scholarship, and thank you for spending this time with us. We want to thank all of you for taking time out your busy schedules to join us. Those who are watching and can continue to watch our YouTube station, we thank you for your questions. We weren't able to get to everyone's question, but we will answer the questions that we do have. So at this time, we're going to have our distinguished leaders exit the stage. We're going to take this time to have a book signing. We have books offered in the bookstore for purchase. Orlando. And we also we have a QR code that will give you the opportunity if we sell out of books, because it's first come, first serve basis. You can go on with the QR code and purchase a book through Amazon. Okay, again, we want to say thank you. We have dessert still outside. Enjoy yourself, and God bless you. Thank you. Oh. Key. Okay.